This lecture discusses commedia dell'arte. Commedia dell'arte is all about the characters. It's an improvisational form of drama that is based around archetypes or stock characters. Stock characters are easily recognizable characters that you don't have to think about. They are basically the same character from one instance to the next. Commedia was popular for a very long time. Its popularity has never completely gone away. The characters and the situations that you see in commedia are often seen in modern-day sitcoms, particularly classic TV sitcoms. We see a lot of the same characters, a lot of the same archetypes, a lot of the same situations in classic sitcoms that we see in commedia. The exact origins of commedia are unknown. We assume because of the names and the settings of a lot of the scenarios that it's Italian in origin, but they traveled all throughout Europe. The use of stock characters also suggests that it has some basis that goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks and New Comedy, because that's where stock characters began. They traveled quite a bit, so we see some roots in the Middle Ages traveling troops as well. Its exact origins are unknown, but what we know is commedia was very popular for quite a long time. And again, a lot of the situations and characters that we see from commedia are still used today. This page is going to be an important one. You'll see multiple questions coming from this page. The top note alone is pretty important. First thing you have to understand about commedia is that they worked from a scenario rather than a play. You did not have written dialogue. What you had was a general plot, and every actor knew his character really well, and they would follow the plot based on how that character was supposed to behave. So the situation was set up from the beginning, but the character's behavior was based on the actor's understanding of that character, and they would improvise, they would make it up as they went along. So the first thing is a scenario rather than a play. Another thing you see from that top note that you might see again is the use of lazis. And what these were pre-planned bits of business. Some of them fell into the category of big physical comedy, so chases and fights, things of that nature where you'd want to choreograph it so no one got hurt. That would be one type. Another type would be bits of comedy they knew they could go back to for a laugh, so picking a flea or something of that nature. The most basic thing to understand about commedia is the use of stock characters. Masters, lovers, and servants were the major categories that characters fell into. The word zani now means clown in modern Italian. It grew from the servants from commedia. In a typical scenario, what you would have is the lovers wanting to be together but not doing much to get together. The masters were usually their fathers and were against the lovers getting together, and the servants usually worked in the lovers' houses, and they were the ones who would typically pull the strings to get the lovers together. If it sounds like Romeo and Juliet to you, it sounds a lot like Romeo and Juliet to me. So a lot of the characters that we see in commedia can also be found in Romeo and Juliet. When you're looking at the characters in general, there's a couple of things that you can look at to figure out who's who. What you have to understand is that commedia troupes tended to travel, so you might not always speak the language that was native to the country you were in. But if the audience understood who the characters were, they could figure out the situation and they could follow the story pretty easily. So the first thing that you can look at is their costumes. So here we're looking at Pantalone. Every Pantalone or every Pantalone type character would wear a costume like this. Another thing you could look at would be their stances. So the way that they held themselves, the postures that they were in, represented particular characters. So you might not always have a Pantalone, for example, but you would always have a character that served the function that Pantalone did. So if your audience could figure out who the characters were, they could figure out what their functions were, and the scenarios would make sense even if they didn't understand the dialogue. As you go through and look at the character cards, it's going to be the top note from each of them that you're going to want to know. For Pantalone in particular, what you want to know is the top note. He was the head, the father, the patriarch of the most respected family in town, which was usually the most wealthy, the most powerful family in town. In classic sitcoms, he would be the dad's boss. You don't see the dad's boss character as much anymore. It was a lot bigger in the 60s and the 70s, but that's the character he would serve in sitcoms. In Romeo and Juliet, because he was typically the male lover's father, he would be equal to the character of Romeo's father, Mr. Montague. You had to be very careful with Pantalone because he was very powerful and he was very savvy. He had some weaknesses, and it was the weaknesses you could exploit. He loved money, and he was usually a widower who loved young women, so you could use these weaknesses against him in order to get around him to get the kids together. For Il Dottore, you can think of him as the dumb dad. The biggest thing to get is that he was supposedly very wise. He was the doctor, Il Dottore, the doctor. So he was supposedly very wise, but he was actually easily tricked. He was fairly dim. It didn't take much to get around him. So whereas you had to be careful with Pantalone, fooling Il Dottore was not very difficult at all. If we're looking at Romeo and Juliet, this would essentially be Mr. Capulet, Juliet's father, because Il Dottore usually served as the female lover's father. If we're looking at sitcoms, this is your classic dumb dad character. There's a whole lot of dumb dad characters that we've seen over time. Sitcoms love having the dad who's never quite sure what's going on. Another version of Il Dottore that we find in a very prominent place is the character of Polonius in Hamlet. He's Ophelia's father, and he's sort of that character who blabbers on without actually saying much of use. If you had a third master character, it was usually Il Capitano. Il Capitano was a pawn. He was a tool. He was usually used by one of the other characters to get the plot moving. Il Capitano was not a captain. He called himself the captain, but he was not a captain. He was either a captain who had been stripped of that title in disgrace, or he was just some guy who decided to call himself the captain. He always came from somewhere else, so he pretended to a higher status. But the servants would figure out that he was not who he claimed to be, and they could use that information to blackmail him so that they could get the master characters to do what they needed them to do. As for the lovers, it's important that they were there, but there wasn't anything that was very particular about them. They were young, they were pretty, they were in love with the idea of being in love. In Romeo and Juliet, obviously, these are Romeo and Juliet. In sitcoms, these would be your teenagers, the son and daughter or the offspring of your dumb dad. Arlecchino was the straw that stirred the drink. He was the one who typically drove the action, primarily. Sometimes through scheming, sometimes by accident, usually both. What would happen is he would come up with an idea, he would hatch a scheme, that scheme would go horribly awry, but things would work out in the end because it's comedy, and in comedy, things are supposed to work out in the end. In sitcoms, he can be the wisecracking teenager, but he can also be sort of the wacky next door neighbor character, the one who takes the situation that the dumb dad has gotten himself into and makes it worse. You'll also find Arlecchino in Shakespeare. Arlecchino equates to a character called Puck in A Midsummer Night's Dream. His function is very similar, as is his behavior. The other thing I'd like to point out on this page is the object he's got under his left arm. If you look at that bottom note, that's called a slapstick. A slapstick is literally a prop stick. You use it to hit people with, and the sound that it makes it seem as if you've hit them a lot harder than you have. Slapstick is also the term that we use for that sort of comedies. Three Stooges type comedy where people are getting hit with things, people are falling down, people are getting hurt, but it's funny. We call that slapstick comedy, and this is where that comes from as well. A lot of what we see from modern clowning, a lot of what we see from modern comedy in general comes from commedia dell'arte. And lastly, Columbina. Columbina was the sanest character, by which we mean she could see things as they truly were, and if something went wrong, she could usually fix the problem and get things done. In sitcoms, this is your wisecracking wife. This is your long-suffering wife who's been dealing with the dumb dad for 20 years now, but she knows what he gets up to, and she's usually the one who can figure out how to get him out of the jam that he's in. In Romeo and Juliet, this is Juliet's nurse. Columbina and Arlecchino were often paired. If they weren't a bickering couple that had been together forever and now everything that they did annoyed each other, then Arlecchino spent some of his time that he didn't spend trying to get the kids together, trying to get himself together with Columbina. And that's pretty much it from commedia dell'arte. When you go to study, pay particular attention to the individual characters. Stock characters were everything to commedia dell'arte, so when you take a quiz or an exam, you will see the stock characters come up.